Many know the tale of the lost English colony of Roanoke, but fewer know of Scotland's. It was called New Caledonia, and it was the Scots' grand gamble on the Isthmus of Panama. In 1698, 5 ships set sail with the hopes of a nation on board. However, within 2 years, the colony was dead, the dream shattered, and Scotland's future forever altered. This is the story of the Darien Scheme. By the late 17th century, Scotland, like much of northern Europe, was struggling. 7 ill years were marked by continual failed harvests and widespread famine. Savage winters, the coldest of nearly a millennia, held for a decade. And a sluggish economy following the War of the Three Kingdoms had left many Scots desperate for a way out. The idea of an overseas trading company, one that could lift Scotland into global commerce, took on urgent appeal. In 1695, the Scottish Parliament chartered the Company of Scotland, trading to Africa and the Indies. The company's backers promised a bold, risky solution: a colony on the narrow Isthmus of Panama that could control trade between the Atlantic and the Pacific. The plan was audacious, and many Scots poured their savings into the idea. Estimates of capital raised were massive. At approximately £400,000, it was an enormous portion of Scotland's liquid wealth. William Paterson, a Scottish merchant and financier who had helped found the Bank of England, was one of the scheme's principal architects. He had long pitched the idea and saw it as both patriotic and profitable. In securing a colony on the Gulf of Darien, they could create an overland trading route between the oceans, predating what would later become the Panama Railroad and Panama Canal. Wild dreams of riches swirled, and plans were laid. Investors from across the country, nobles, merchants, and ordinary folk, bought shares on that hopeful prospect. Once funds were raised, a council of leaders was chosen to support the colonial effort. The company assembled a fleet of 5 ships for the first expedition: St. Andrew, Caledonia, Unicorn, Dolphin, and Endeavour. In mid-July of 1698, to avoid the prying eyes of the English Royal Navy, they left port from Leith, carrying roughly 1,200 settlers, a mix of artisans, soldiers, laborers, and hopeful families. Their orders were simple: establish a fortified settlement, secure supplies, and, ultimately, open a trade route across the isthmus. The fleet sailed around the northern tip of Scotland, a terrible decision, later deemed equally traumatic to the entire colonial experience. They traversed the Atlantic through to the Caribbean and made landfall on November 2nd, 1698, and claimed a site for the colony, declaring it New Caledonia. In the steamy jungle heat, settlers hastily built Fort St. Andrew. They armed the fortifications with 50 cannons and constructed a mountainside watchtower. Once complete, they proceeded to build the larger settlement, dubbed New Edinburgh. Immediately, the choice of location and their timing carried consequence. The site was swampy, mosquito-ridden, and poorly sheltered from storms. Strong tides could wreck vessels as they departed the harbor. Fresh water and food sources were difficult to secure. Problems only worsened. A sweltering and humid local climate decimated crops. Dysentery and malaria ravaged the camp, and natives were unwilling to trade as a result of poor treatment by the Spanish. The Scots underestimated just how quickly supplies could spoil in such a harsh environment. Following the first losses of settlers, the mortality rate continued to climb, reaching 10 settlers per day. The few gifts of fruit from natives were stolen by leaders and sailors who kept to themselves aboard the ships. The only reliable food source was from hunting giant turtles, a task that grew exponentially more cumbersome as able-bodied men fell to illness. The colony's plight was beyond environmental. It was also political. Spain had claimed sovereignty over Panama and viewed any foreign settlements in the region as hostile. Worse for the Scots, England, with whom they shared a monarch, but not a government, was unwilling to help its Scottish cousins. Pressed by diplomatic caution and commercial self-interest on the tenets of mercantilism, Englishmen were barred from assisting them. Crucial ports in the Caribbean refused supplies. Only alcohol was available, and was given as a reward by the council that presided over the colony. A fateful decision that only hastened the demise of men who were weakened by dysentery and fever. In July 1699, after 8 horrific months, the first colony was abandoned. The weak were left to the elements, and survivors staggered out from the Gulf. Only 300 of the original 1,200 colonists had survived, and losses would only continue to mount. The first ship had been denied call at Port Royal, Jamaica, forcing its beleaguered return to Scottish shores. They were received as a national embarrassment, ultimately disowned by their families. The ships Caledonia and Unicorn sailed north to the harbor of New York. When docked, Will Patterson and 250 survivors had received word that 2 additional ships, the Olive Branch and Hopeful Beginning, had already been chartered to resupply their now abandoned colony. Thomas Drummond, Darien colonist and man of infamy following his involvement at the massacre of Glencoe, commissioned 2 sloops to return and aid their efforts. However, they would arrive too late. In the misty bay of Caledonia, on September of 1699, they discovered charred timbers of the Olive Branch, left awash and rotting on the shore. The resupply mission had arrived a month prior, in August, and were shocked by the completely deserted and overgrown settlement. As their crews debated their next course of action, an accidental fire swept over the Olive Branch. Survivors of the resupply mission had then fled to Jamaica, leaving Drummond once again in a difficult position at the failed colony. News of the disasters at Darien had not come quickly enough to prevent a second expedition. Loaded with another 1,000 hopeful souls, leaving from Scotland, a fresh fleet had arrived at Darien November 30th, 1699. Morale was abysmal. They learned immediately that they would not be joining a thriving colony, but rather starting from scratch with Drummond and his sloop crews. Apathy only grew. Bitter debates flared regarding the reconstruction of fortifications. Drummond believed that a Spanish attack was imminent and quarreled with the merchant James Byers about who should lead following the failure of the first expedition. Drummond was arrested and his associates sent away. Byers continued his tirades before himself abandoning the colony. Sadly, Drummond's prediction would come true. Spain had not forgotten. As their forces were mobilized, the geopolitical reality became clear. They would not cede control of their strategic Isthmus territory to a Scottish enterprise. Confrontations grew tense, and the new settlers found their prospects even bleaker than before. They faced a month-long siege by Spanish forces, ultimately surrendering upon threat of no quarter. By early 1700, after disease, famine, and hostile pressure, the colony was abandoned for good. Contemporary tallies suggest that more than 80% of the colonists died within a year of arrival across both attempts. The human toll was catastrophic. The economic impact at home was as dramatic as the human loss abroad. The Company of Scotland had tied up enormous amounts of capital, a significant portion of the country's liquid wealth. When the venture failed, investors were ruined. Merchants and nobles went bankrupt. Families were devastated, and national finances staggered. Some contemporaries argued that the disaster left the Scottish elite with no choice but to consider union with England, a path that would offer financial guarantees and access to the larger market. While historians debate how directly the Darien disaster caused the 1707 Acts of Union, the economic shock is widely considered a major catalyst. The Darien Scheme lives on in Scottish memory as both a symbol of ambition and a cautionary tale. The remains of New Edinburgh are few, swallowed by jungle. The ruins, a quiet monument to human error at imperial scale. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode, please consider liking and subscribing. Until next time.